And the way that we have it now, in terms of the Bible, divided conveniently for us into Old Testament and New Testament, just inculcates a very particular framework for thinking about Christian theology. So when you open up the Bible, obviously you start at the Old Testament, you start with Genesis, creation, fall, long history of salvation, Exodus, exile, prophets, temple, destruction, all of that kind of thing. So you get, the birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, the passion on the cross, and you get the book of Acts, and you get the epistles. And so you're not forced. If you think about it, you'd realize it is otherwise, but it just kind of gives you a shape for thinking about Christian theology, starting with creation, long history of preparation for salvation, birth of Jesus, the Passion, Ascension, Pentecost, Acts, Epistles, kind of a long narratival line like that, at which the birth of Jesus is one episode, the Passion's another episode, and so on and so on. And we think because we're reading it like that, we're being historical. But in fact, we're not being historical, because they weren't written like that. Yeah. So what we call the Old Testament, Jesus calls Scripture, Paul calls Scripture, the Apostles call Scripture, the Nicene Creed calls Scripture. If it's called Scripture, it's probably a good enough term. By calling it the Old Testament, you're kind of relegating it to the historical past prior to Christ, the history of Israel, temple, and all that kind of thing. When they're referring to it as Scripture, they're doing something quite different. Yeah. If you believe Moses, you believe me because he wrote of me. So you've got these scriptures, the law, the Psalms, and the prophets, which are written over the 1,000 years before Christ. They're edited, they're collected, all of that kind of history. Whatever's going on with their history, you have all of those scriptures there at the time of Christ. It's like a field of literature. They weren't printed in a single book. They're rolls, they're gathered together in a library. The rolls aren't in any particular order, but you've got this field of literature. And then after the Passion, as it puts it in the Road to Emmaus, Christ opens the scripture to show how it spoke about him, how Moses and all the prophets spoke about how he had to suffer to enter into his glory. The same point can be made with regard to Paul. He knew all of those scriptures, but it didn't lead him to Christ. It led him, in fact, to persecute Christ in the body of his believers.